Hello YouTube, hopefully it's not been too long since you saw my last video. Today I'm coming to you with my fall TBR, so all the books that I want to read this fall. The autumn equinox is upon us at the moment, so I have a very large list of books that kind of match that atmosphere. It's the season for supernatural books, witchy book, extremely frightening books, basically dark magic all around. Of course, there's never a bad time for dark magic, but fall is just a special time for that. Not gonna lie, I've been in a huge reading slump lately. Basically, I finished my degree and I've just been so exhausted that I just haven't wanted to do much with my brain. So I don't know if I'm gonna get to all of the books on this list this season, but a girl can dream. So let's get right to it. This is my fall TBR. First on my list is Two Dark Reigns by Kendar Blake. This is the third book in the Three Dark Crowns series. I'm actually really ashamed that I haven't already read this book because I really love this series. The Three Dark Crowns series is probably one of my favorite fantasy series in the past 3 or 4 years. It's about an island kingdom, which is basically a matriarchy. Every generation, the queen of the island has a set of triplets, and each of these triplets belongs to a different magical faction on the island. And when these triplets turn 16, they have to fight to the death for the throne of the island. So the second book, One Dark Throne, which I have read, kind of ended on a pretty stable spot. It wasn't quite the cliffhanger I was expecting, but I can see how there would be really some massive repercussions in the future, so I'm definitely looking forward to reading this book. I watched a reading vlog from Reagan from Peru's Project, and she was reading the fourth book and just gushing about it, and I had such book envy. So now I want to read and finish this series ASAP. Really looking forward to this book this season. Next up is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I believe I have this as an ebook. So this is about two university students called Victor and Eli who discover how to make superhuman abilities, but then something goes terribly wrong and it causes them to become arch enemies. Of course, V.E. Schwab is a writer I love. I loved A Darker Shade of Magic, and I also loved This Savage Song, which I read earlier this year. But this is a series that I've been really keen to get my hands on. The next book on my TBR is something I actually have a physical copy of, and that is A Skinful of Shadows by Frances Hardinge. I believe this is set during the English Civil War. This is about a girl called Makepeace who has a space inside her that is ideal for spirits to come and hide and possess her. And generally she's been good about fending off ghosts, but then she actually becomes possessed by a spirit, and that is both a good and bad thing. This copy is actually signed by Frances Hardinge. I actually met her at Yalka last year and she was so cute and thoughtful, but somehow I just haven't picked this up and read it in the past year since I got it. But it's historical fiction and it's got ghosts in it, so I think the fall season is ripe for an atmosphere like this. Next up is Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. This, of course, is another historical fantasy read surrounding, of course, a very famous serial killer, but with a twist. I love the Victorian era, and of course I'm especially interested because recently I read From Hell by Alan Moore, which is also a piece of speculative fiction about Jack the Ripper. Now, I don't expect this series to be as deep as Alan Moore's From Hell, but I'm hoping it's going to be fun and atmospheric and most of the things I want from a series like this. Next up is Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray. This is a sequel to The Diviners. I read The Diviners last year. I really loved it. It's set in Roaring Twenties New York. The main character is a girl called Evie who has some supernatural abilities. She can sense the history of an object by touching it, and she decides to utilize that ability by solving some supernatural crimes. It was the first book I read last year and I was hoping to get to it but never did, so I'm really hoping to get back into the series. Sometimes I feel like my whole life is just hacking my way through a thicket of cool stuff that I need to consume in order to get to other cool stuff. Next up is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is a secondhand copy. Someone in one of my societies at university was giving away a bunch of their books and I decided to take this. This is about a girl called Agnieszka, and she lives in a village that relies on this wizard who's called the Dragon to sustain their way of life. But as tithe, every 10 years or so, the dragon comes to the village and takes a girl with him for a while. Of course, we all know that she's going to be taken because otherwise there'd be no story. But I've heard really great things about this book, and of course, you can't go wrong with a fantasy in fall. Next up is a book called It Devours, which is a Night Vale novel. And of course, if you don't know, Welcome to Night Vale is an amazing podcast. The podcast is basically a fictional story about a town where weird and supernatural things happen, and it's told in the form of a radio broadcast. And as a spin-off of that, the writers of the podcast have written a couple novels. I have read the first Welcome to Night Vale novel. I thought it was okay. I thought it was a little too grounded for what Night Vale is. What happens in Night Vale is that it's just stuff you don't understand and it's super trippy. But I'm in the mood for some Lovecraftian horror, which Night Vale never fails to deliver on. And I have this on audiobook, so I think it should be a good listening experience. And of course, you can never have too much of Cecil Baldwin's voice. Next up is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This book was turned into a very excellent miniseries on BBC. It's set in an alternative England during the Regency era. This was when the Napoleonic Wars were at their height. But in this alternative England, there are wizards. Magic exists, but most of the magicians who practice it are practitioners of theoretical magic. So-called applied magic hasn't been practiced in a while. The primary magician who actually practices magic is Mr. Norrell. But then it turns out there's another wizard called Jonathan Strange, and he goes to Mr. Norrell for apprenticeship. But then the two of them develop their own diverging ideas on magic, and that contributes a lot to the conflict of this novel. I remember enjoying the series immensely because it reminded me so much of real academic infighting that I've witnessed, as one does when one gets involved with research. And of course there's a whole to-do with fairies, so of course I can't say no to historical fantasy with wizards and fairies. Next up is A Discovery of Witches. So like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I actually watched this TV series first. I was just really curious about it and its portrayal of witches. And I did enjoy the series, but I will say it's kind of Twilight for middle-aged academics, which can be a really good thing or a bad thing. But I did really love the portrayal of magic and witches, and I was really interested in the world, so of course I wanted to read the book. And on the vein of witches, I also want to read A Secret History of Witches by Louisa Morgan. From what I understand, this is a generational story of a family of witches. And along that same vein, I also want to read Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman, which is also a story about a family of witches. I cannot get enough of the witchy books. And lastly, I want to read The Wicked King by Holly Black. This is of course the sequel to The Cruel Prince, so I've been really hoping to get to The Wicked King before The Queen of Nothing comes out, which is the last book in the series. And of course, if you don't know, The Cruel Prince is about a girl called Jude. She's taken to live in the land of the fairies when she's very young. Her fairy guardian is actually the person who killed her parents because her mother used to be the wife of this fairy but then absconded. So in the first book, it deals with her feeling very rejected and wanting to belong in the land of the fairies. So she decides to build her power when she gets the opportunity to become a spy for one of the fairy court. And I love how Holly Black writes fairies. I love how she brings out how fun and weird they are. I loved her world, and I really love Jude, the main character. She resonated with me so much. Having a certain hunger for respect is something I really can relate to. So hopefully I'll be able to read this and then immediately be able to pick up the third book. So those are the top books I want to read this fall. Let me know what books you want to read this fall. What are you hoping to get round to? What have you been putting off until the fall season? In the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter and Goodreads. Like this video if you want more of this content, and of course subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next video.